Listen carefully. What I'm about to tell you was never meant for public ears. For 24 years, the truth lay buried beneath lies, silence, and the kind of shame that corrodes the soul of a nation. But secrets have a strange hunger. They don't die. They wait. They wait for the right moment, the right witness, the right confession. And when they surface, they claw open wounds so deep that entire families, entire towns, even entire systems of power cannot look at themselves the same way again. It begins in the sterile silence of a Queens, New York clinic, October 15, 2002. A dying man whispers to a nurse, his body frail, his voice cracking, yet behind those tired eyes burns something almost violent, something he can no longer keep inside. "Call the police," he begs. "Before I die, there's something I must confess." Now pause and consider that moment. A man with only days left to live chooses not to cling to comfort, not to hold the hand of family, but to summon the state, to hand over a truth that he knows will detonate across decades. Who does that? What kind of truth is so corrosive, so unbearable, that a man would rather die exposed than die silent? Detectives arrived the next morning, casual at first. They had heard confessions before. Drug runners, violent husbands, mobsters whose lungs rattled from too many winters of smoke and blood. But this was different. Samuel Miller's words did not belong to the world of petty crime. They belonged to something older, deeper, forbidden. "I took 3 children," he whispered. "Triplets. In 1978. Imagine the room. The fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The pen in the detective's hand pausing mid-stroke. 3 children. Triplets. For 24 years, the story of their disappearance had haunted Kentucky like a curse. July 23, 1978, the day 3 identical boys, Kevin, Luke, and Michael Sutter, vanished without a track. Their grandmother knocked unconscious, the fields and barns combed by desperate townsfolk, the FBI stepping in, national headlines screaming about the Cedar Creek triplets. And then, nothing. For years, their mother Linda woke to phantom cries in the night, swearing she heard her boys calling her name from the dark. For years, their father Thomas drank himself into oblivion, blaming himself for leaving them in someone else's care. For years, strangers passed posters stapled to telephone poles, the smiling faces of 3 children staring back, frozen in time, as if daring the world to admit the truth. And then, like most cases, silence. Until that October night, 2002. The detectives leaned in. "Where are those children now?" one asked, the words thick with disbelief. Samuel's answer was simple and devastating. "I raised them." The confession ripped through the walls of that clinic like a thunderclap. The police were no longer speaking to a frail old man. They were staring into the abyss of a secret that had devoured a family for 24 years. But here's where the story turns darker, because this isn't just about a man and 3 stolen children. No, this is about the machine behind it. The hidden economy of missing children. The networks of shadowed men who traffic in lives the way others trade in stocks. It's about the way institutions protect themselves by burying truths, ensuring that parents like Thomas and Linda never get closure, not because the trail runs cold, but because the trail runs into places too dangerous for the public to see. Samuel Miller didn't just stumble into this crime, he was pulled into it, offered a deal, a chance to have the children he and his late wife could never produce. And here's the detail most people gloss over: 3 children, not 1. Not 2, 3, identical triplets. Do you know how rare that is? A genetic anomaly, a perfect set. Do you think it's an accident they were chosen? Do you think money was the only currency at play here? Look deeper. Look beneath the newspaper clippings, beneath the official timelines, beneath the tear-stained pleas on television. There's something older than grief at work. Something that has always existed in the shadows. A hunger for control, for ownership, for bloodlines. Because when 3 boys vanish, the surface story is kidnapping. But the truth, what festers underneath, is about engineering. It's about manipulation. It's about bending life itself to serve hidden agendas. Samuel Miller thought he was a desperate man buying a family, but in reality, he was just another pawn in a system designed to disappear children. And the triplets, they weren't just stolen, They were erased, rewritten, folded into a narrative that was never theirs to begin with. This is where our descent begins, down into the marrow of secrets, down into the forbidden history of what really happens when innocence is taken and transformed into property, down into the chambers where power feeds on silence. So I'll ask you, before we go further, do you really want to hear what comes next? Because once you do, there's no going back. The detective's hand tightened around his notepad, knuckles white, because in that moment he understood this wasn't just a confession, it was an indictment of a system that thrives on disappearance. Samuel Miller lay propped against hospital pillows, his breathing shallow, but every word struck with the force of a hammer. "I raised them," he said again, as though repeating it would make the reality clearer to men who had spent careers wading through lies. But let's pause here, because you have to understand the kind of man Samuel was. Not a hardened criminal, not a cold-blooded trafficker. He was a printer, a small business owner in Louisville, Kentucky, the kind of man who wore pressed shirts even when no one was watching, who walked the same route to work each morning, who ate the same lunch every day, who kissed his wife's photograph before bed long after she was gone. He was ordinary, boring even, but desperation can bend the most ordinary man into the most dangerous shape. For 20 years, he and his wife tried to have children. 20 years of false hope, miscarriages, adoption rejections, slammed doors, until one day she died, leaving him hollow, staring at empty bedrooms that were supposed to be filled with laughter. And that's when the offer came. It wasn't presented as a crime. No man walks into another's life and says, "Would you like to purchase stolen children?" No, it came softly, conversationally, through the mouth of a long-time customer, someone Samuel trusted. That's how these networks work. They don't appear as villains. They wear the mask of familiarity, of neighborly trust, of friendship. They never look like what they are. The man leaned across the counter of Samuel's print shop one afternoon, his voice lowered. "I know someone who can help, if you really want children." At first, Samuel thought he meant adoption. He laughed it off, but the man didn't laugh. He stared back, eyes dark, steady, unblinking. That silence was Samuel's initiation. Days later, Samuel was taken on a drive through back roads, far out of Louisville, past farms that had collapsed into weeds, past barns sagging like corpses, until they reached a house in rural Kentucky, a house with no neighbors, no sound except cicadas whining in the heat. And that's where Samuel saw them, 3 identical boys. You need to understand the effect of that sight. Triplets, identical in face but distinct in the flicker of their eyes. To Samuel, it must have looked less like a crime and more like a miracle. He thought fate had finally relented. He thought God had finally answered. But behind miracles, there is always a cost. The offer was made. 3 boys, healthy, yours for $300,000. A fortune, yes, but not impossible. Samuel sold his home, drained his savings, liquidated everything. Do you see it? He thought he was choosing to sacrifice, but in truth he was being chosen, pulled into a current far larger than himself. And here's where the darkness grows thicker, because this wasn't an isolated case. This wasn't one grieving man stumbling into one wicked opportunity. This was part of an operation, a market, a system. The 1970s and 80s were riddled with missing children, headlines that came and went like weather reports. And yet, beneath those headlines there were patterns, the rare ones, the twins, the triplets, the children with unusual genetics. They didn't just vanish, they were targeted. Think about it. Triplets are rare enough to be considered genetic anomalies. 3 lives born from 1 egg, 1 womb, 1 moment of chance. Do you really think a network capable of abducting children, capable of laundering identities through false paperwork and fabricated family tragedies, would overlook such an opportunity? No. The Sutter's boys were not random victims. They were chosen. Samuel didn't know that. He thought he was just filling a void, but in reality he was the final link in a chain. Behind him stood men with far more power, men who treated human lives as commodities, as experiments, as investments. And that is the forbidden truth. These systems of disappearance, they aren't about chaos, they are about control. Control over identity, control over lineage, control over the very definition of family. Now think of the Sutters, Thomas and Linda, the parents. What were they left with? Silence, empty bedrooms, a community shaken but powerless. Their grief was real, yes, but it also served a purpose. It kept the public looking at the family, the sheriff, the small town, instead of looking at the networks that had engineered the abduction. You see the trick? Focus the world's attention on the local tragedy, and no one asks about the machinery behind it. No one questions why so many children disappear each year, why investigations go cold not because of incompetence, but because they are meant to go cold. Samuel's confession cracked that illusion. His dying words were a key shoved into a lock no one was supposed to touch. And once turned, it revealed something terrifying. That the triplets weren't lost. They had never been lost. They had simply been reassigned, raised under new names, enrolled in schools, introduced to neighbors as distant relatives. Their lives reprogrammed like files on a hard drive. Now consider this. If 3 children could be erased and rewritten so cleanly, how many others have been? This is not a story about one family's grief. This is a story about an invisible hand shaping who we are allowed to be. About the theft of identity not just from children, but from all of us. And as Samuel's voice weakened, as detectives leaned closer, he admitted the part that still tore him apart, even as he loved those boys like his own. They cried for their mother, he said, his lips trembling. For weeks, I told them she couldn't come, and then they stopped asking. That is how control works, not by brute force, but by silence, by erasing memory, by replacing one truth with another, until the original self becomes unrecognizable. That is how identities die, not with violence but with forgetfulness. And now you must ask yourself, if this can be done to children, if an entire life can be rewritten, what else has been rewritten in your own history? What truths have been stolen, silenced, reassigned? Because the triplet story isn't just their story, it's a mirror. And when you look into it, you might not recognize the face staring back. Imagine being 3 years old. Your world is small but radiant. The warmth of your mother's hand, the sound of your father's voice, the smell of your grandmother's kitchen. These are anchors, fixed points in the fog of early memory. Now imagine them ripped away in one night, replaced with the voice of a stranger who insists he is your father, who insists this is your name, who insists the past never happened. That was the reality for Kevin, Luke, and Michael Sutter, reborn, against their will, as Kent, Luke, and Sean Miller. Same faces, new names, same bodies, new identities. A clean cut, like scissors through cloth. At first they screamed. For weeks, Samuel recalled, the boys wept into the night, calling out for their mother. "Mommy, please come. Mommy, please take us home." But children learn quickly what adults spend lifetimes refusing to accept, that no one is coming. The crying dwindled, the memories dimmed, and then silence. This is the first weapon of psychological control, dislocation. You sever a human being from the landscape of their life, the people, the sounds, the places that define who they are, and their sense of self begins to unravel. Memory is not fixed. It is a living current. Cut it off, and the mind adapts to survive. Samuel gave them new stories. "Your parents are gone," he told them. "I am your father now." The human mind, especially a child's, is desperate for stability. So eventually the boys accepted the lie because to resist it meant drowning in chaos. But ask yourself, was Samuel acting alone? Do you think he invented the scripts, the fabricated paperwork, the precise ways to normalize the abnormal? No. These were systems, processes, networks designed to scrub children clean and reintroduce them as if they had always belonged. Birth certificates forged, school records filed, neighbors fed believable half-truths. The infrastructure of disappearance was already there, long before Samuel entered the picture. And here is the most disturbing truth. These networks did not just steal children, they stole memory itself. Because what is identity but memory arranged into narrative? Rewrite the narrative, and you rewrite the person. For the boys, the years passed. Kent excelled in debate, learning how to bend words into weapons. Luke buried himself in books, hiding in the worlds of others. Sean, the quietest, spent hours sketching faces, faces that seemed to emerge from some buried recollection, fragments of a life he no longer knew he had lived. To outsiders, they were the Miller boys, 3 gifted brothers, tragedy in their background, but otherwise unremarkable. No one asked too many questions, no one saw the ghosts flickering in their eyes. But here is what no one tells you. Children remember more than they admit. Even when language fails, the body remembers. Trauma imprints itself into posture, into reflexes, into the small pauses between breaths. Kevin, now Kent, would later recall flashes, the shape of a farmhouse window, the smell of hay, a woman's laughter echoing down a hall. But as a child, he had no words for it, so he let it slip away. That is the second weapon of control. Substitution. You take the raw fragments of memory and replace them with new ones. Samuel filled their days with ritual, family dinners at the same time, weekly outings to the same park, repetition so relentless it drowned out the echoes of what came before. The boys learned to call him Dad. They learned to love him, because what choice did they have? And here lies the paradox that haunted them years later. Samuel was both their captor and their caretaker. He stole them, yes, but he also raised them, fed them, clothed them, held them when they cried. For 24 years he became the only father they knew. Imagine the psychological fracture, to love the man who stole your life, to grieve for him even as you learn he destroyed your past. That is not just tragedy, that is programming. Because here is the forbidden layer, the one you were never meant to see. The Sutter's triplets were not just children, they were assets, rare genetic copies, a matched set, and in the hands of hidden systems, assets are never wasted. Samuel thought he was saving them. In truth, he was preserving them, keeping them alive, educated, useful, until the day came when their value could be unlocked. Think about it. Why triplets? Why children whose identical DNA could be tracked, compared, tested? Do you really believe the men behind the abduction were motivated only by profit? Or was something larger at play? An experiment, perhaps? A study in how identity could be fractured, erased, and rebuilt? And here's where the sickness spreads further. Because if 3 boys could be reshaped so thoroughly, what does that say about the rest of us? What stories have been replaced in your own life? What parts of your history are substitutions fed to you until you accepted them as truth? The Sutters lost their children not only to an abductor but to a system that understands one brutal fact. Memory is malleable. Change what a person remembers, and you change who they are. So when Samuel confessed in 2002, he wasn't just admitting to a kidnapping, he was tearing open a curtain on something far darker, proof that identity itself can be stolen, packaged, and sold. And you, sitting here listening, are left with one unbearable question: how much of your life is truly your own? When Samuel Miller exhaled his final breath in 2002, the words he left behind did not stay buried with him. They leaked. Through detectives, through case files, through whispers in corridors never meant for sunlight. And eventually, they reached the ears of the very men he had raised as his sons: Kent, Luke, Sean. 3 grown men, living lives that seemed normal on the surface. Jobs, marriages, children of their own. Their Miller surname was stamped on every document they had ever signed, carved into every diploma, every driver's license, every tax return. To them it was not a disguise. It was the bedrock of who they were. Until one day it wasn't. Imagine opening your door to 2 detectives in pressed suits, carrying thin files that weigh more than mountains. Imagine being told that your father, the man who taught you how to ride a bike, how to tie a tie, how to be a man, was never your father at all. That you were born someone else, to parents you do not remember, in a town you have never visited. That the life you built is standing on stolen ground. That is what Kent Miller faced first. The eldest, the debater, the one who had always prided himself on control. He laughed when they told him. A cold, mechanical laugh. The kind of sound that bursts from the body when the mind refuses to process the impossible. He shut the door, but the seed had been planted, and it spread through him like rot. Luke received the news differently. He sat in silence as the detective spoke, his face pale, his eyes vacant. He did not argue. He did not resist. Instead, he felt something crack open deep inside, a hidden chamber of memory, a woman's voice, a farmhouse, shadows moving in the night. He had spent decades burying it, and now, with a single confession, It surged back, raw and merciless. Sean, the quiet one, the artist, was the last to know. When they told him, he didn't speak at all. He simply turned to the sketchbook that had never left his side. Slowly, carefully, he began to draw a woman's face. Not from imagination, not from invention, but from memory. A face he had never been able to name. A face that was impossibly real. Their mother. Do you see the fracture? 3 men, bound by blood they had forgotten, now forced to confront a truth too heavy to carry. They were not the Miller brothers, they were the Sutter triplets. And that meant their entire lives, their achievements, their marriages, their children, were standing atop a grave. But here is where the horror deepens, because when the truth came, it did not bring freedom. It brought surveillance. Reporters hovered like vultures. Government agents, men in plain clothes with unmarked cars, watched their homes, their workplaces, their families. Because this was not just a cold case solved. This was evidence of a network. And networks do not like being exposed. The brothers felt it. Phones clicking, letters missing from mailboxes, strange men watching from across the street. The triplets were not just victims, they were liabilities. Living proof that children could be stolen, erased, and reassigned so seamlessly that the world never noticed. And this is the forbidden truth. Once a system has written itself into your life, it does not simply let you go. You belong to it, even when you resist. Especially when you resist. Kent grew angry. He wanted names, dates, accountability. He filed requests, demanded answers from the state. Each time, he was met with red tape, sealed files, and polite refusals that carried an unspoken threat. For your safety, they told him, but whose safety did they really mean? Luke turned inward. He stopped speaking to friends. He spent hours pacing his house at night, staring at family photographs that now felt counterfeit. He would press his palms against the glass, whispering to faces that should have been familiar, but felt like St. Rangers. His wife later said it was as if he was grieving for a life he had never lived. And Sean painted. Faces, places, fragments of memory. His canvases grew darker, more violent, as if trying to claw through the veil of forgetting. But what he painted was not random. Investigators who later saw the work realized with horror that Sean had drawn places he could not possibly have remembered in detail. The Sutter home, the sheriff's office, even the rural farmhouse where he had been handed over. His mind had not forgotten. It had simply been waiting for permission to remember. And so the triplets' awakening became a wound, not only for them, but for everyone around them. Because this was no longer just a story about 3 boys stolen in 1978. This was about the machinery behind it, the men who made it possible, the systems that kept it hidden, the experiments it may have been serving. And when people awaken to systems like that, the system always responds. That is why files went missing. That is why testimonies were sealed. That is why even now, when you look for the Sutter's triplets in official records, you will find almost nothing. It is as if they never existed. But they did. And their existence is proof of something far more terrifying. That identity is not fixed. That the story you live may not be yours at all. And that behind the walls of history there are hands rearranging lives like chess pieces. And the Sutter's triplets were just one move in a much larger game. The confession shattered their lives, but what came after was worse, because the more the brothers searched for answers, the clearer it became. This was never random. Why them? Why 3 identical boys plucked from one farmhouse in rural America? Why preserved, protected, and hidden for decades, when most abducted children vanish into graves or anonymous files? The answer lay not in who Samuel Miller was, but in what the brothers were. From the moment they were born, the Sutter triplets had drawn attention. Identical siblings are rare enough, but identical triplets, that was genetic lightning, one chance in millions. Their very existence was an anomaly, and anomalies attract eyes. Even as children before they were taken, there were rumors, state officials visiting the Sutter farm under the guise of health checkups, strangers who asked strange questions about the boys' sleep, their speech, their habits. Their parents never spoke of it openly, but neighbors remembered. And when Samuel confessed decades later, those fragments re-emerged like fossils in dirt. Here is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Triplets are mirrors. They are copies of the same code. Scientists, especially those working in the shadows of the Cold War, were obsessed with them, because with triplets you could test one variable while holding everything else constant. You could separate them, raise them under different conditions, and watch how their identities fractured, how their bodies adapted, how their memories held or broke. And that is the sickest part. The Sutters disappeared. Hence was not just a kidnapping, it was data collection. Think about it. 3 identical children stolen as one unit, erased and rewritten. Raised in secrecy yet kept alive, educated, monitored. Every year they lived was another year of information. How well does the lie hold? How thoroughly can memory be overwritten? How does love for a captor replace love for a parent? These were not accidents of circumstance. These were questions being tested. And Samuel? He was not the mastermind. He was a handler, a custodian. Perhaps he even believed the story he told himself, that he was saving the boys from some darker fate. But handlers don't write the scripts. They follow them. The triplets' awakening in adulthood triggered something else. The memories. It began with dreams. Kent woke sweating, heart pounding, with images of barns, police lights, the metallic taste of blood. Luke heard lullabies in a woman's voice he had not heard in decades. Sean, always the most haunted, sketched drawings that grew more exact, more precise, as if his hand remembered what his conscious mind could not. Soon, patterns emerged. Each brother recalled the same figure, a tall man in a dark coat who visited Samuel during their childhood. He never stayed long. He rarely spoke to the boys, but they remembered his presence, cold, watchful, clinical. The triplets had no name for him. Investigators later called him the Overseer. And here is the question that still burns. If Samuel stole them, who was the Overseer watching for? The truth points in only one direction. The abduction of the Sutters triplets was not an isolated crime. It was part of a network of disappearances, threaded through time and space, stitched together by men who wanted not ransom, not revenge, but control. Control of memory, control of identity, control of the human mind itself. For years, the triplets had lived like actors on a stage, never realizing the script had been written long before they were born. Their lives were proof of concept, their identities a laboratory, and this is where the story bleeds outward, because the Sutters were not alone. Files unearthed in fragments, testimonies from survivors in hushed voices, all point to a grim pattern. Twins, triplets, even siblings stolen and recast under new names, scattered across the country like seeds. Some remember, most never do. But here, with the Sutters, something cracked. Samuel's confession was a mistake, a breach in the wall of silence, and once that wall was cracked, the brothers began clawing at it, desperate to see what lay beyond. And what they found was not just their past. It was a map of something larger, something that explained why their lives had been stolen, why their memories had been reshaped, why even now their every move was being watched. The question was no longer, who were we? The question was, what were we for? The Sutters thought they were alone, 3 stolen brothers bound by a single tragedy. But when they began searching the cracks of their own lives, old newspapers, sealed police records, the whispers of others who had lost children, they uncovered something that turned their private nightmare into a glimpse of something vast. Because the Sutters' case was not unique. The deeper Kent dug, the more he found files that rhymed with their own. Twins who vanished from hospitals in the 1960s, siblings declared stillborn, but later rumored to have been seen alive, families who swore their babies were switched at birth. In every case, official paperwork told a neat story. In every case, eyewitness accounts whispered another. One woman in Ohio remembered her twins being taken away after a complication during birth. She never saw them again. Decades later, she stumbled upon photographs of 2 teenagers who looked exactly like her husband, down to the shape of their jaw. Another family in Arkansas reported 3 children stolen in 1974. Police ruled it a runaway case, but the descriptions of the boys matched too closely with others found years later bearing new names. And then came the documents, Luke, who had once worked for the state, knew how to slip into archives not meant for public eyes. What he found were fragments, heavily redacted reports, case numbers tied to non-existent files, references to developmental assessments that were never explained. Again and again, the same phrase appeared in margins and cover sheets, written in a shorthand almost clinical in its detachment. Siblings of high genetic value. The words chilled him, because they implied selection, not random crime, not opportunistic kidnappings, but a system. And when Sean laid his drawings beside these fragments, the picture grew sharper. The overseer who had visited them, as children, appeared in his sketches again and again. Cross-referencing with photographs hidden in archived newspapers, Kent found him. His name was never published outright, but he was pictured in the background of hearings tied to state-funded child welfare programs in the late 1970s, always on the edges, always watching. This is where the Triplet story collided with a darker truth. The Sutters were not simply children stolen for one man's obsession. They were test subjects in a quiet war, a war not fought with guns, but with genetics, memory, and control. The Cold War was a breeding ground for secrets like this. Governments across the globe hunted for ways to mold the human mind, to rewrite loyalty, to bend identity itself into something programmable. And what better laboratory than children too young to resist? What better subjects than identical triplets, living mirrors of one another, whose differences could be measured, recorded, dissected? Suddenly, the strange details of their upbringing snapped into place. Samuel's strict routines, the random visits from strangers who asked questions they never understood, the notebooks he kept locked away filled with charts and numbers, even the punishments which now seemed less like discipline and more like calibration. They had been raised in an experiment, their memories tested, their loyalties measured, their very sense of self was data feeding into a machine they could not see. And this is where the horror expands, because when they compared notes with other families, when they whispered with survivors brave enough to speak, they realized the Sutters were not the beginning or the end. The network stretched wide, coast to coast, children stolen, reassigned, tracked. Some broke down, some adapted, some vanished completely. And all of them carried the same scar, the haunting suspicion that the life they lived was never really theirs. The Sutters' triplets had been a test case, a single thread, but pull on that thread, and the whole fabric of the hidden world begins to unravel, and what lay beneath was something none of them were prepared to face. The Sutters believed that once Samuel confessed, the nightmare was over, that by dragging their story into the light, they could finally escape the shadows that had stolen their childhood. But the shadows moved with them. It began subtly. Sean noticed the same car parked across from his apartment 3 nights in a row, its headlights off, engine idling. Kent received anonymous calls filled only with static. Luke's mail was tampered with, resealed in ways too precise to be random. At first they dismissed it as paranoia, the residue of trauma, but soon the pattern was too sharp to ignore. They were still being watched. The realization cut deep. Samuel had been only one link in a chain, not the chain itself. His role had ended the day he slipped and revealed the truth. But the program, the overseers, the data collects, Tors, the architects of this hidden machinery, they had never stopped. The Sutters were still assets, still subjects, still property. The evidence came crashing down one night when Kent broke into Samuel's locked storage shed after his death. Inside, he found a battered steel box filled with notebooks. Not diaries, not letters, but records, charts of their growth, logs of illnesses, injuries, even their emotional breakdowns. Graphs comparing each brother against the others, notes written in a code that Kent could only half decipher. Symbols for memory retention, symbols for resistance, symbols for pliability. And on the last page, 3 stamped photographs, each of the brothers as adults, marked with evaluation dates only months old. The program hadn't ended. It had followed them into adulthood. The brothers were stunned. Had their marriages, their friendships, their jobs, every aspect of their adult lives been guided, manipulated, tested? Suddenly, every betrayal, every inexplicable failure, every coincidence felt orchestrated. They weren't just haunted by their past, they were living inside its continuation. And then came the contact. Sean received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, the overseer, older now, but unmistakable. On the back, written in tight block letters, were 4 words: "You were never finished." The letter confirmed what they feared most. The Sutters were not survivors of an experiment. They were the experiment, still running, still monitored, still unfolding. Their entire lives had been a theater, and the audience was still watching. It was Kent who put it into words one sleepless night. What if we were never meant to find out the truth? What if Samuel slipped because they wanted him to? What if even this, our anger, our rebellion, is just part of the design? That thought ate at them. Because once you begin to doubt the ground beneath your feet, you stop trusting anything, even your own mind. Were their memories theirs, or implanted? Were their choices genuine, or orchestrated? Was their rage authentic, or simply the next phase of the test? This is the suffocating genius of the program. Once you begin to doubt, you cannot stop. Doubt becomes the experiment. And the Sutters, like rats in a maze, kept running, desperate to find an exit that may not even exist. And as they dug deeper into the networks of other stolen children, the terrifying truth became clear. The Sutters were not alone in being unfinished. Others had received the same letters, the same photographs, the same unshakable feeling that their lives were being steered by invisible hands. It was never about one family. It was about proving a theory, that identity is not a birthright, but a construct, something that can be erased, rebuilt, and controlled. The triplets thought they had uncovered their past, but what they had really uncovered was their future, and somewhere, even now, someone was still holding the pen that wrote their story. The Sutters gathered in Kent's dimly lit basement, surrounded by boxes of files, Samuel's notebooks, and taped interviews with other broken families. It was the closest thing there. I had to proof, evidence enough, they believed, to shatter the silence. But silence, they realized, was also protection. "Once we go public, we can't go back," Luke muttered, flipping through one of the coded ledgers. "If this really is as big as we think, they'll bury us. Or worse. Maybe the only reason we're alive is because no one's paying attention. The second we start shouting, we'll be on a list." Sean disagreed. His voice cracked with fury. "We've already been on a list our whole lives. Don't you see? They're still writing our story. The only way to end it is to drag it into the open, burn the script." But Kent was the quietest, and that silence unnerved the others. He had been digging the longest, threading patterns together, and what he saw unsettled him most. He laid Samuel's final notebook flat on the table and pointed to a single phrase scrawled in the margins: "Outcome depends on disclosure." The words suggested something terrifying, that the program expected them to reveal the truth. That exposure itself was not rebellion, but the final stage of the experiment. What would happen when the Sutters stepped into the public eye? Would they be dismissed as conspiracy theorists? Or would people listen, and in listening, become participants in the same psychological machinery? It was the ultimate trap. Silence meant obedience. Exposure might mean activation. Their meetings grew more tense, arguments cracking open long-buried rivalries. Sean accused Kent of cowardice. Kent accused Sean of recklessness. Luke tried to mediate, but his own paranoia bled through. Was the conflict itself part of the design? Were their very disagreements scripted, just another test of loyalty, of identity, of fracture? And then, like clockwork, another signal arrived. A brown envelope slipped under Luke's door in the dead of night. No handwriting, no postage. Inside was a newspaper clipping dated the day before, a small obituary for a woman in another state. The photo was unmistakable. It was the Ohio mother who had once sworn her twins were stolen, dead at 61. Natural causes. The timing was too sharp, too cruel, too deliberate. The message was clear. This was the price of speaking out. And yet, beneath the fear, something else stirred in the brothers. A question sharper than any threat. If they silence us, what happens to the others? What happens to the ones still trapped? The decision loomed over them like a blade. Remain silent and protect themselves, or speak, and risk becoming exactly what the overseers wanted. Sean stared at the boxes of evidence, at the grainy photographs of stolen children and the endless charts measuring their own lives. His voice was barely a whisper when he said it. They took our past. Maybe they'll take our future, but I'll be damned if they take our silence too. For the first time since Samuel's confession, the brothers felt aligned, not in certainty but in resolve, because whether exposure was the end of the experiment or the beginning of something worse, there was no longer any safety in hiding. The Sutters were stepping into the light, and somewhere, unseen, the overseers marked the date. Once the decision was made, the brothers moved quickly. They knew hesitation would only invite more fear, more interference. Kent scanned and encrypted Samuel's notebooks. Sean began recording testimony videos late at night, his eyes red-rimmed but unwavering. Luke reached out to a contact at a local paper, a reporter known for chasing stories no one else dared print. It should have felt empowering. Instead, it felt like stepping onto a stage already built for them, because as soon as they began moving toward exposure, the world began to tilt. Kent's hard drive failed, wiping weeks of scanned files. The technician at the repair shop shook his head. Strangest thing, I've never seen corruption this surgical, like someone knew exactly what to erase. Sean's testimony recordings, played back the next day, were distorted. His voice warped, sentences chopped in half, as though another signal had bled into the feed. When he replayed the files, he swore he could hear a whisper layered beneath his words. Not yet. Luke's contact at the paper stopped answering calls. 3 days later, Luke saw her name on the evening news. A car accident. Fatal. Coincidence, perhaps. But the Sutters were long past believing in coincidence. The pressure grew heavier. Strangers appeared on their street corners, never approaching, just standing, watching. Sean's wife received a phone call in the middle of the night, a man's voice calmly reciting the names of her children. Kent's apartment door was left unlocked one morning, though he swore he'd bolted it. Inside, nothing was stolen. Instead, a single item had been placed on his kitchen table, a chess piece. A knight. It was not just intimidation, it was choreography. Every move they made was answered. Every step toward exposure met with a countermove designed to remind them, you are still inside the game. Kent grew quieter, haunted by Samuel's scrawl. Outcome depends on disclosure. He began to fear they weren't exposing anything at all. They were fulfilling the program's final requirement, a performance designed to test how far desperation could push them. Sean resisted that paranoia with fury. So what? Let it be a test. Let them watch. I'll burn it all down anyway. But Luke, the mediator, was unraveling fastest. He woke in the night to find his window open, though it had been locked. On his desk, beneath the flutter of curtains, lay a single Polaroid photograph. It was the three of them, not as adults, as children, standing in Samuel's yard. The photo had never been taken by them. None of them remembered the moment. And yet there they were, captured, catalogued, kept. It was proof they were never just a family. They were specimens. The brothers' resolve hardened. If this was still the experiment, then the only way to fight was to break it, to scream so loudly that no manipulation, no suppression could contain it. But what they didn't realize was that the overseers had already prepared for that possibility, and the louder they spoke, the clearer it would become that exposure was never an ending. It was the next phase. The night of their reveal arrived like a storm. Sean had arranged everything. An independent journalist, one with no corporate ties, willing to record and stream their testimony live. No chance for edits, no chance for silence. The brothers agreed. If they were to speak, it had to be raw, immediate, undeniable. They gathered in Kent's basement once more, the air thick with sweat and fear. Stacks of files, photographs, and Samuel's notebooks lay scattered across the table. A camera light blinked red. The feed was live. For the first time, the Sutters told their story in full. Sean's voice cracked as he described Samuel's experiments, the years of manipulation, the coded notebooks. Luke held up the Polaroid of their childhood selves, demanding answers from the unseen audience. Kent, though trembling, revealed the phrases Samuel had left behind. Outcome depends on disclosure, and admitted his own terror that this moment might be exactly what their overseers had wanted all along. For an hour, they spoke without restraint. Thousands tuned in. The chat scrolled like wildfire. Disbelief, horror, mockery, sympathy. Screens across the country flickered with the Sutters' faces. Their story was out. They thought they had finally broken free. But then, the feed cut. Not abruptly but smoothly, like a curtain lowering at the end of a play. The screen went black. A few moments later it displayed a seal. Not a government seal, not a logo anyone recognized, just a stark insignia, 3 interlocking circles, and then a voice. Calm, low, unmistakable. The subjects have fulfilled the parameters. Phase 3 is now active. The stream ended. Across forums and social media, panic erupted. Viewers swore they had seen the message. Others claimed the broadcast had glitched, showing only static. Some insisted it was all performance art, a hoax staged by desperate men. Confusion spread like contagion. The Sutters' testimony was already being drowned beneath waves of disinformation, memes and arguments. And in that chaos, something even stranger happened. People began receiving letters. Not just the Sutters, but strangers across the country. Envelopes slipped under doors, tucked into mailboxes, containing photographs of themselves, some as children, some in places they didn't remember being, each marked with a date, each stamped with the same insignia of 3 interlocking circles. It was no longer about the Sutters. The experiment had spread. Kent collapsed in despair. We didn't end it. We triggered it. We weren't exposing the program. We were the announcement. Sean raged, pounding the basement wall until his knuckles bled. Luke sat frozen, staring at the blackened screen, his reflection flickering in its glass. For the first time, he didn't know if he was looking at himself or the version of him the program had written. The Sutters thought they had escaped the cage by screaming to the world. Instead, they had widened the walls, and somewhere behind the curtain, the overseers were watching, not just 3 brothers anymore, but millions. Phase 3 had begun. The Sutters expected silence or retaliation. They hadn't expected infection. Within days, the 3 interlocking circles appeared everywhere. Spray paint, on underpasses, scrawled onto bathroom stalls, etched into desks in high schools across the Midwest. It became a symbol without origin, replicated faster than anyone could track. Some dismissed it as the latest viral meme, others whispered it was a recruitment mark. And then the letters spread wider. Thousands of people posted photos online, childhood images they didn't remember taking, each stamped with a date they couldn't explain. A girl in Nebraska held up a picture of herself in a hospital bed at age 3, except her parents swore she'd never been hospitalized. A man in Boston showed a photo of himself shaking hands with someone he'd never met, in a city he'd never visited. The internet boiled with theories: government program, corporate social experiment, alien contact. Some insisted the letters were fakes, seeded to stir chaos. But what unsettled everyone was how personal the evidence was. Whoever they were, they had your face, your history. News anchors tried to debunk it, but their voices faltered when viewers flooded networks with their own envelopes. A senator admitted on live television that she had received one. Days later, she resigned without explanation. The Sutters watched all of it unfold with growing dread. They had lit the fuse, but the firestorm was larger than anything they'd imagined. Sean wanted to press harder, release everything, dump every file Samuel had left into the world. If the game's already started, then let's flood the board. Let's burn every lie they've built. But Kent was breaking under the weight. He barely spoke, his face hollow, as though Samuel's final warning echoed louder every day. Outcome depends on disclosure. He began to suspect that the overseers weren't losing control, they were tightening it. That every post, every photo, every terrified person uploading their own letter was not rebellion, but compliance. Luke tried to find hope, telling himself that at least people were awake now, that maybe the overseers couldn't smother billions once the truth spread. But even he began to notice the shift. Crowds forming around the circle symbol, strangers speaking in chants he couldn't quite understand, gatherings that looked less like protests and more like rehearsals. The world wasn't resisting, it was organizing. And one night, as the brothers watched footage of a rally where thousands carried torches marked with the 3 circles, Luke whispered the question none of them wanted to ask. What if this was never about us? What if we were just the pilot episode, and now the series has gone worldwide? No one answered, because deep down they knew. The experiment had left the lab, and now the world was the laboratory. By autumn, reality itself had become suspect. Every screen, every voice, every piece of evidence was as contested. A photo of a child stamped with the 3 circles might appear online. Within hours, another image surfaced disproving it, and then another, debunking the debunk. People didn't know what to believe anymore. Families fought in their kitchens, co-workers argued in offices, churches split down the middle. Who's real? Became the question whispered in streets. Not what is real, but who. Videos leaked showing government officials at hidden facilities marked with the insignia, only for those same officials to appear live the next day, insisting they'd never been there. Forensic experts examined the footage and declared it authentic. Other experts tore it apart as digital forgeries. Both sets of experts had credentials, records, reputations. Both were convincing. The Sutters watched the world collapse into a hall of mirrors. In small towns, neighbors accused each other of being subjects. In cities, mobs formed, dragging people suspected of being part of the program into the streets. Some begged, some stayed silent, some recited strange phrases in unison, as if triggered. Sean raged louder than ever. This is it. This is the breakdown. They want us tearing ourselves apart. He pushed for escalation, hacking networks, breaking into archives, anything to rip open the machinery. He believed exposure could still be salvation, if only they screamed louder. Kent disagreed. His voice was low, resigned. Don't you see? We're not in control of what's true anymore. They don't have to silence us. They just have to drown us. He stared at Samuel's final line in the notebook, words he now read differently every time. Outcome depends on disclosure. Maybe disclosure wasn't a key. Maybe it was a trigger. Luke tried to hold them together, but the strain carved deep shadows into his face. One night he confessed a secret he had been hiding. He too had received a letter. A photograph of himself, not as a child, not as an adult, but as an old man. Wrinkled, pale, standing in a room he did not recognize, his eyes hollow. On the back a date written in neat mechanical script. That date hadn't arrived yet. It meant the overseers didn't just record the past. They recorded the future. The brothers sat in silence, the weight of inevitability pressing down like lead. The experiment was no longer about observation. It was about authorship, and the Sutters were realizing far too late that disclosure hadn't freed them. It had folded them deeper into the script. Outside, the world tore itself apart over what was real. Inside, the brothers faced a more chilling question. If the overseers already knew their ending, was there ever a choice? By winter, the 3 circles weren't just graffiti or letters anymore. They had become banners. 2 factions rose from the chaos. The adherents believed the overseers were architects, guiding humanity toward its next stage. They wore the circles like armor, tattooed on their skin, stitched into black armbands projected onto skyscrapers at night. They claimed the letters weren't warnings but invitations, proof that their lives had been chosen. The other side called themselves the Breakers. They wanted to tear the system down, to resist whatever force had orchestrated the experiment. But even they were fractured. Some thought exposure was the weapon. Others believed silence was the only shield left. In their desperation, Breakers burned entire neighborhoods marked wit. Circles convinced they were rooting out subjects. Governments tried to hold order, but their leaders were crumbling too. Too many senators, ministers, generals had received envelopes. Some disappeared entirely. Others began quoting the overseers' phrases in speeches, their words eerily similar to Samuel's notebooks. The world wasn't divided by nations anymore. It was divided by belief. The Sutters became ghosts in the middle of it. Sean pushed for joining the Breakers, convinced resistance was still possible if they acted fast enough. We light the match and burn it all. No overseers, no program, no future they can script for us. Kent resisted. He had grown skeletal, speaking rarely, but when he did, it chilled the room. The Breakers think they're fighting back, but they're still inside the maze. Every reaction we make, they've already accounted for it. That's the point. There's no outside. Luke was caught between them. He kept staring at his letter, the photo of his aged self. Some nights he dreamed of that moment, waking with the taste of dust in his mouth and the smell of ozone, like he had been pulled forward into his own ending. And then, one night, the overseers made their presence undeniable. Every screen in America flickered at once, televisions, phones, laptops, whether powered on or not. For 30 seconds the insignia appeared, the 3 interlocking circles pulsing like a heartbeat. Then came the voice, calm, certain, inescapable. The room went silent, because if Samuel was long dead, who had written that? And worse, who had left it there for them to find? Phase 5 began at midnight. All across the world, the sky fractured, not with thunder, not with fire, but with silence. A silence so deep that every bird, every engine, every voice stopped. People looked upward, and the stars themselves seemed to shift into a new arrangement. 3 burning circles interlocked, glowing with unnatural symmetry. The overseers had come, not ships, not creatures, something worse. Shapes half visible, as though reality itself was bending to allow them passage. They did not descend, they unfolded. Figures taller than buildings, faceless, with endless limbs that shimmered in and out of existence. Wherever they appeared, crowds of adherents knelt without being commanded, their voices rising in perfect wordless harmony. The breakers tried to fight. Gunfire rattled, missiles launched, but each weapon bent before reaching its target, collapsing into nothing as though it had been erased from possibility. The Sutters watched from the hills outside town as people around them dropped to their knees, their eyes rolling white, their bodies swaying in rhythm. Luke clutched his photograph, the older version of himself standing hollow before 3 shadows. The silhouettes in the photo were no longer silhouettes. They were here. Sean roared in defiance, grabbing the last rifle they had. "I won't kneel. I won't. If they want obedience, let them take it from me." He charged down the hill toward the nearest circle of light where the overseers had appeared. His scream echoed against the still sky until his body froze mid-stride. He hung in the air for a second, trembling, then folded into nothingness. Erased. Kent didn't move. He only whispered, as if he had known this would be the ending all along. "Subjects don't win. They conclude." His eyes closed. His breathing slowed. He sank to the ground, not resisting, not submitting, simply fading as though he had been swallowed by the silence. That left Luke. He felt the air crackling, saw the world kneeling, heard a voice not in his ears but inside his blood. Witness. He looked down at his photograph one last time. The older man in the image stared back, hollow and broken, standing in this exact moment, with the overseers at his back. The truth struck him then. The photo had never been a prediction. It had been an instruction. The overseers hadn't shown him what would happen. They had shown him what he was meant to become. Slowly, trembling, Luke lowered himself to his knees. The ground pulsed beneath him like a heartbeat, syncing with his own. Above him, the 3 burning circles overlapped, fusing into a single blinding point of light. The last thing he saw before his vision dissolved was the horizon bending, folding in on itself, as though the world was being rewritten line by line. And then, nothing. Only silence. Only design. Only the overseers. Division complete. Subjects prepared. Phase 4. Convergence. The screens went dark. Across the world, panic gave way to order, not by governments, but by factions. Adherents rallied in vast stadiums, chanting in one voice. Breakers barricaded themselves, armed and waiting. In the streets, ordinary people clutched their envelopes, waiting for the date on the back to arrive, waiting to see if their life was already over. The Sutters stood at the center of the storm. They were no longer just survivors of Samuel's cruel experiment. They were the spark that had set the world on fire. And now, with Phase 4 beginning, they had to face the truth none of them wanted to say out loud. Maybe this wasn't about saving the world. Maybe it was about surviving its redesign. The convergence began quietly, not with explosions or wars, but with synchrony. At first it was small, crowds of adherents chanting in unison, their words matching perfectly even when separated by continents. Then, stranger reports emerged. Thousands of strangers across different time zones waking at the exact same minute, all describing the same dream. Drivers halting their cars simultaneously at green lights, birds migrating in unnatural patterns, forming the 3 circles across the sky. It was as though reality itself was aligning. The Sutters saw it firsthand in their town. During a grocery run, Kent froze as everyone in the aisle stopped moving at once. Shoppers, clerks, even a baby in a stroller, all motionless, all breathing, all staring ahead. Then, after 15 seconds, they resumed, continuing as though nothing had happened. Luke whispered, trembling, "We're not people to them. We're data points. They're running simulations, and now we're syncing to the program." Sean still refused to bow. His rage burned hotter than ever. "Then we fight inside the system, break their rhythm. If they want unity, we give them chaos. If they want compliance, we give them defiance." But Kent shook his head. He looked hollow, his eyes sunk deep. "Don't you get it? Even your rebellion is part of the design. They need dissidence. It proves the control works. They've scripted the fire you think you're starting." Luke said nothing. He had been studying his photograph more closely, the one showing him old and hollow. In the background of that image he noticed something he hadn't before. 3 blurred silhouettes standing behind him. Not his brothers, not anyone he knew, watching, recording, and he began to wonder, was this photo showing his future, or was it showing the present, one he couldn't yet perceive? That night, the 3 brothers returned to Samuel's last notebooks, searching for any clue. Near the end, they found a single page that none of them remembered seeing before. The handwriting was Samuel's, but the ink was fresh, as though it had been written only days ago. It read, "Phase 4, the world unites. Phase 5, the overseers arrive. The Sutters must decide, be witnesses or be erased."